I'd like everyone to think about an inspiring experience that happened to them. It may be something recent, it may have been something a while ago. This could be personal or professional. But put yourself in that moment and in that experience and those emotions. If you want, close your eyes, really get there. And then together, I'd like us all to take a 4-count breath. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, and just hold it for a moment. The word inspiration comes from the Latin, and it means to breathe in, to take breath. And we all know what inspiration feels like. There's often an uplifting experience. Inspiration is amazing. It makes things that weren't possible before possible. It lifts barriers and obstacles. It gets you into action, and it can make you have your best days more often. As we work with organizations, one of the things that we hear most often that is challenging is around the pace that's required, the pace of innovation, the pace of growth, financial growth, and product growth. Inspiration is the solution. I'm going to make a case today that inspiration is a most vital, most critical, and most valuable resource to be managed and to be cultivated, and it starts with you. In order to make that case, we're going to go on a little bit of an inspiration journey, and I want to first talk about what inspiration is, then I want to talk about how it works, and then most importantly, how to grow it. But before that, I want to tell a story of an inspiring experience that happened to me. This was 15 years ago at Johnson & Johnson, and my boss, who was a vice president, was moving on and was being replaced by an internal candidate who I had never met before. So of course I went and did some internal due diligence to try to find out who my boss was going to be. It was a man named Dennis Driver. And here's what I found out. I found out that Dennis was wildly competent. This was the word on the street, super competent, tons of global experience, really tall. People kept saying he's really tall, 6'3", 4". He was a former Marine Corps officer, and he had a temperament that was reported to be fair but firm. The Marine Corps officer part got me a little nervous. So when he asked me to pull some data for our first one-on-one, I went a little overboard and ended up with a 5-inch binder of information just to be ready. We had our first one-on-one. It was on a Tuesday at 2 o'clock. It was his second day on the job, and our meeting started right at the chime of 2. He invited me in, sat me down at a table adjacent to his desk, and he opened the meeting by looking me in the eyes and saying, "I hear that you've done great work. What is it that you'd like to build next?" Let me tell you, this was not the question I was expecting. I was expecting, what's broken, what do we have to fix, and let me tell you how we're going to fix it, right? So his inspiring question actually moved me to action. I sat there for a moment, and then I trusted my gut, and I stood up from the table, and I marched over to his whiteboard. And I started drawing an aspirational idea that I had never shared with anyone. And it was an idea for a leadership accelerator called the Center of Excellence in Leading and Learning that could actually service the entire region. And he stood up at the whiteboard and joined me. And the next 45 minutes, we went into what I would call an inspiration wormhole. We shared ideas, we shared experience, we shared hopes. And in those 45 minutes, we learned worlds about each other. As our meeting came to a close, we sat back down, and he had another question for me. He said, "What do you need from me in order to build this?" Again, not a question I was expecting. again, I was inspired. And then he and I mapped different pathways and possibilities for how we might make this happen. He closed the meeting by sharing, he said, one of the things that I learned in the Marine Corps is that it's my job to make you so strong and to make this system so strong that if for some reason I have to step out or I have to step back, that no one will notice. He said, we need you. We need your great work. I want to support you to build this. And then he also said, of course, we have to sort through priorities and make sure that we can get it done. That day, new worlds opened up to me. That day, I went from being a loyal employee, doing a really good job in my role, to being an owner and a completely committed driver of the future. When we founded InspireCorps, our company, we just started with the question of what's the most extraordinary performance that we had seen in organizations and on teams and with leaders, and the word that kept coming up was inspiration. So we went to the literature, and what we found was that there isn't a lot on inspiration. Not in social science, not in neuroscience. We don't know a lot about it, and in fact, Webster himself had to use the word inspire to define inspiration. So we knew there were things to learn about this construct. So 3 years ago, we set out to start interviews with some of the most inspiring leaders and teams and organizations. And what we have is a working definition of what inspiration actually is. And it is an intersection between possibility, so that's where the imagination is activated, and invincibility. So possibility, new idea, new thought, new pathway, but it's coupled with invincibility, which we define as an intense need to take action, almost to the point where you can't help but go do it. You are inspired. It happened to me in the moment when I stood up and had to go show him the sketch on the whiteboard. Then there's a kicker. There's a third piece of inspiration. We have traditionally thought about inspiration as it's something that's happening to us, and it's fleeting. And if we're lucky, then maybe it will come back. What we found is that's not actually how it works. That inspiration is a muscle that can be trained. And that is a quotient that we have. We each have an inspiration quotient. Where are you in terms of inspiration for the day? And that through deliberate and intentional practice, we can actually grow the intensity of our inspiration as well as how frequently we experience inspiration. So that's a little tiny bit of the what. There are also some truths that we found about inspiration. The first is that it's very personal, that each of us actually has an inspiration fingerprint that's unlike anyone else's, because it's informed by our entire lives. So it's very personal, and what would inspire me wouldn't necessarily inspire you. The second is that it's agentic. You have agency in creating it, and you can actually figure out how to make it happen more often. And then the third truth is that it's contagious. It's contagious for yourself. You start your day with an inspiring practice, it tends to snowball for the day. Same with contagion across people, right? We're social animals. And so inspiration can build, and we influence one another in terms of inspiration. In addition to the truths about inspiration, we also have identified 18 what we call engines of inspiration. These are the predictable pathways that people use to find inspiration for themselves, and they fall into 3 categories. The first category is how we inspire ourselves. The second is how we're inspired through and with others. And the third category is that there are certain situations or environments that are particularly inspiring, very predictably. There's an interesting thing that came up in our research. There are a number of engines that aren't quite as smiley and happy and elevating. These are engines that are deeper and heavier And they're about hardship, and they're about loss, and they're even about grief. And so I want to share with you a story we heard that was inspiring along these lines. We interviewed a brain surgeon who happens to spend more time in the operating room than anyone else in his state. We were curious about why he was so inspired to be excellent and to produce so much. And the story that he brought forward was this. He said, "I'm the oldest of 7 children from immigrant parents. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. My father worked in an automobile manufacturing plant. When I was thinking about going to medical school, I felt a responsibility that before I could think about that, I needed to help my family get a new refrigerator because we were eating from a cooler. So the job that he had access to was actually required that he cross the picket line at his father's plant. So he took a job as a scab in order to help his family buy a refrigerator, and all of that ridicule that was included. Every day at lunchtime, he sat with his MCAT books, big, thick books. And for some reason, and we don't know the reason exactly, one of his father's friends came up to him every day at lunch and would say, "Son, the sooner you realize you will never go to medical school, the happier you're going to be. You are one of us, and you will not break through, and you're fooling yourself if you think you will. It's not going to happen. I've never seen it. Stay with us." He has this man come back to him this instant in dreams to today. He still has dreams about sitting in the cafeteria and this man walking up to him. But he says when he wakes up, he is fired up. He is moved to action where he can't help but do it. To this day, 30 years later. So inspiration can show up in really surprising places and in surprising ways. I want to close by bringing you right back around to the original experience. Go back to your inspiring experience. Come back to the feeling of it. And now I want you to trust that inspiration isn't something that just happens to you. Start to imagine that it's something that you can cultivate, that you could have your best days more often, that you could source it and know what you need in order to make it happen. I dare you to inspire.